is in this context, in this background, as I have discussed, that how different attempts were made, different ideas were floated, both within Indian National Congress and outside, individually as well as collectively, that we find that finally that comes true. The aspiration for having a constituent assembly finally fructifies, and under cabinet mission plan of 1946, the constituent assembly is created. Of course, one should remember here that this constituent assembly which was created was a constituent assembly for both India and Pakistan. At that time the partition had not happened, but as we know that once cabinet mission plan created this constituent assembly, the first session of the constituent assembly on 9th December 1946, the very first session Muslim League decided to boycott, and before that, before the meeting of the constituent assembly, in fact there was an interim government under the premiership of Jawaharlal Nehru, with both Muslim League and Congress participating into it, country into sliding into communal strife and communal riots. Situation was very grim, and at that time, under the shadow of this communal rights and this type of situation, that the constituent assembly met in December 1946. But one thing we should remember, that the Muslim League decided to boycott this first session of the constituent assembly, and in fact when Jawaharlal Nehru moved this famous objective resolution, which later on became the preamble of the constitution, which is such an important part of India's constitution, that it is today being treated as philosophy of India's constitution, reflecting the philosophy of India's constitution. And Supreme Court in number of judgments now have not only declared preamble to be integral part of the constitution, but also basically relies on it for its interpretation of the various provisions of the constitution, be it justice, equality, liberty, or for that matter democracy, and many other provisions. So therefore, this is something we should remember. Now Congress and Muslim League had a standoff, particularly on the interpretation of cabinet mission plan, and there was one provision which was perhaps the bone of contention. That was the grouping clause of the cabinet mission plan. And this grouping clause, in fact, of course, to put it more simply, was nothing but an arrangement of Indian federal system, which was basically a three-layered arrangement or a three-layered federalism. Normally we are familiar with the center and states as the two units in the federation, but this grouping clause brought in a third layer, that was a grouping of states, and therefore this grouping clause was essentially meant of clubbing certain states as into a group, and there was a provision after certain years, after a lapse of certain period, the states being part of this group can part company, and therefore this became a matter of interpretation. Muslim League and Congress both started interpreting it differently. Muslim League thought that it was compulsory, Congress thought it was optional, because Muslim League thought that its demand of partition or demand for Pakistan, which had been turned down in cabinet mission plan, had been accepted indirectly by giving this provision of grouping clause, whereas the Congress had different interpretation, and therefore this led to a kind of standoff, due to which Muslim League decided to boycott the first session of the Constituent Assembly. Now in first session itself, when this objective resolution was made, presented by Jawaharlal Nehru, in fact there was a heated debate in the assembly, and many members, including the famous liberal member of the assembly, Jaikar, he said that we should not be in any haste in passing this resolution. Let's wait for the Muslim League to join, because this is going to be a very important provision, and therefore let's have them with us before we finally take a call on this. But in fact this matter was debated, and finally in the second session, which started in January, in fact Jaikar resigns, and after that we find that 1947 things were moving in a different direction, which ultimately led to the partition of the country under Mountbatten Plan, 3rd June 1947, and the two dominion states were created, India and Pakistan. In fact this dominion state, just to dwell on this issue a little bit, that what is dominion state? In fact, the idea of dominion state originated way back in 1867 with Canada, a colony acquiring this right of a dominion state. Later on, Australia was given this right of dominion state, and then Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all of them became the self-governing colonies with the right to have a constitution drafted by, of course, with the help of the British Parliament, but nonetheless had lot of rights for self-governance, and therefore they acquired the status of a dominion state. Now, Indians, in course of India's freedom movement, there was a time when they moved from this constitutional reform to Swaraj, but at the same time, there was a liberal opinion within the Congress which also started thinking in terms of dominion state, that India should also get the similar right as perhaps they have given to Canada, Australia and New Zealand. But as I have mentioned, that none other than a political philosopher, theorist of J.S. Mill stature, even he believed, who was championing the cause of freedom and democratic representation, even he believed that it was not a provision or it was not a right which Indians could get at that moment in history, because they were still in the waiting room of history. They had not arrived. They had not yet arrived. So therefore, even dominion state was not considered. But later on, as you must be knowing, that when the situation started changing, Indian national movement and Indian National Congress became a mass organization. Indian national movement became a mass organization under Gandhian leadership, and the social base of Indian nationalism got expanded. In fact, we can see that this demand now graduated from dominion state to Swaraj, and here the Purna Swaraj resolution of Lahore Congress 1929 is quite significant, which was basically presided by Jawaharlal Nehru, and who moved this resolution, and that becomes the famous Lahore resolution of 1929. Subsequent to that, we can also see that how civil disobedience movement was launched by Gandhi in 1930 with the famous Dandi March. Particularly, Gandhi was entrusted by Congress to start a civil disobedience movement for fulfillment of this demand. So therefore, we can see the gradual evolution of India's discourse of freedom from constitutional reforms to Swaraj to dominion state, and finally to this issue of Purna Swaraj in 1929. Now, of course, in the course of this evolution, we can also see a number of changes happening inside Indian society, and here one can just see that how Muslim League started demanding in 1940 a separate nation, particularly known as two-nation theory, that Hindus and Muslims are not only two believer in two religion, two faith, but they are two nations, and therefore they deserve two separate states. Now, this Lahore resolution of Muslim League in 1940 was basically was different from what Muslim League believed or practiced, or what they were demanding till 1928-29. In fact, till the Nehru Committee, because as we should recall that what Muslim League under Jinnah, particularly Jinnah faction of Muslim League, which had decided to join all parties conference, and which formed that Nehru Committee under leadership of Motilal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose as secretary, to frame a constitution and to demonstrate to the Britishers that Indians could also write a constitution. At that time, the Muslim League demand was not for Pakistan or the two nations. Muslim League at that time demanded two things. They wanted a federal polity where there would be a provincial autonomy, the provinces will be autonomous, and number two, they wanted reservation for Muslims in central and state legislatures. Because one thing, in fact, I like to mention here, that Muslim League politics also had many problems, and one of the important problem was to basically synthesize, or one can say harmonize, the aspirations and demands of Muslim minority provinces and Muslim majority provinces, because Muslim majority provinces were more comfortable with federal demand, particularly provincial autonomy, because they thought that that would usher in a different era for them, because they will be able to rule those territories where they are in majority. But in Muslim minority provinces like United Province, UP, and other places, they were more comfortable with the issue of representation and reservation. So therefore, there was a division within the ranks of the Muslim League, both in terms of the issues as well as their demand. And Aisha Jalal has shown through her writings that how this division was becoming more prominent gradually. So therefore, what we find that this Muslim League demand of 1940 was a culmination or a different from what Muslim League had demanded in 1928 in Nehru Committee, particularly Jinnah, and the only issue on which perhaps the Muslim League under Jinnah walked out of this Nehru Committee was reservation for Muslims in Muslim majority provinces. Congress was ready to give reservation in Muslim minority provinces, but was not ready to give in Muslim majority provinces, which was not acceptable to a Muslim League faction of Jinnah, and therefore what he famously called parting of ways, and that was perhaps the end of the constitutional phase of Jinnah's career, as well as a Muslim League brush with the nationalist politics. Then onwards we find that it of course moved in different direction, and this 1940 resolution is the best testimony of this fact. So therefore we can see that the Constituent Assembly therefore in 1946 when it meets, Muslim League boycotts it. I have already mentioned that it was largely on account of the interpretation of Cabinet Mission Plan and its grouping clause. Congress and Muslim League had different interpretations to offer, but finally, as we know, that when it was boycotting the Constituent Assembly meeting, the first session in 1946, Constituent Assembly went ahead and passed that moved that objective resolution. And finally, the partition happened in 1947, and India Independence Act of August 1947 finally creates two dominion states, India and Pakistan. Here, in fact, I would like to mention here, which I alluded in the beginning also, and I will refer to this in course of our discussion later, that how India breached this provision of the Cabinet Mission Plan and India Independence Act of 1947. India of course was created a dominion state like Pakistan, but India basically went beyond it, and therefore when the constitution was drafted, the Constituent Assembly settled this constitution. This draft was not presented to the British monarch for signature and approval as it was stipulated in the Cabinet Mission Plan. Instead, the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, Rajendra Prasad, signed it, and other members of the assembly followed him, and therefore that was the republican, or one can say revolutionary moment in the life of India's constitution. In fact, Phillips has done a very interesting work showing how this happened, how it breached it. In fact, the number of interpretations by the jurists and the legal experts, they believe that by doing this, if India made it a document which was turned it into a revolutionary moment and declared the people to be a writer of this constitution, we the people, as the preamble famously declares, we the people solemnly resolve to constitute India. That doesn't mean that it was a revolutionary constitution like France and United States of America, because the Constituent Assemblies in these countries were formed after revolution, and the revolutionaries, the people, participated it, and therefore they became famously the author of the constitution. But Indian case was different. It was created by Cabinet Mission Plan, it was created by the Act of British Parliament, and therefore even if Indians tried to repudiate it and breach it by declaring people to be the author of this constitution, we the people, nonetheless neither India had a bourgeois revolution like France and United States of America, because this metaphor we the people is a product of that particular moment, the bourgeois revolution, and therefore India doesn't fit into this case. Nor the Indian Constituent Assembly was sovereign, because the sovereignty lay with the British Parliament, not with the Indian people. But anyway, this debate I am basically simply referring to. I don't have time to go into deep so far as this matter is concerned, that what is the status of we the people in India's constitution, in spite of the fact that it was formed by the Cabinet Mission Plan and the Constituent Assembly in fact tried to repudiate it and making we the people as the author of the constitution. But nonetheless, one thing is important to remember, that transfer of power was basically the usual word used in the Constituent Assembly deliberations. Of course, revolution was also used, but it was used occasionally, but mostly the term transfer of power was used at least by the administrators and the legal experts, and particularly the colonial colonial rulers and bureaucrats, because that was considered to be a transfer of power, orderly transfer of power through laws, because it was not a revolutionary rupture as it happened in case of the bourgeois revolutions of France and United States of America. And therefore, I have mentioned in the very beginning that India is not a case of a revolutionary constitution, but evolutionary constitution as it is mentioned. But still one cannot simply sidestep this issue that there was a revolutionary moment in the life of India's constitution, particularly in the drafting stage and enactment stage. And this moment came when it was not submitted to British monarch for signature. But anyway, so I leave this issue here, that particularly how we the people became the author of India's constitution. So in fact, this transfer of power and partition of the country both happened simultaneously, and therefore what we find that both happened simultaneously, and the Constituent Assembly and the interim government which were formed by the cabinet mission plan completely got transformed later with partition, because what happened that now the Constituent Assembly of India and Constituent Assembly for Pakistan became the two different entities, and the interim government after 1947 was didn't compose of Muslim League members, but it was mostly the Congress leaders. Of course, the government which was formed under Nehru's after partition had many members of political parties outside the Congress, like B.R. Ambedkar became the law minister, Syama Prasad Mukherjee of Hindu Mahasabha became a member of his cabinet. So you can see that number of members from other political parties also joined the government. So one can say that it became some sort of a national government, not a Congress government, which was the predominant or the dominant party in the Constituent Assembly and Indian Parliament, because Assembly was functioning both as Constituent Assembly for writing the Constitution and Parliament for legislating law. So now coming to this question of Constituent Assembly, that how it was originally formed under Cabinet Mission Plan. Now Constituent Assembly was elected indirectly by the provincial legislatures, whose election had happened in 1945, and in fact interestingly these provincial legislatures were themselves, rather 1946 this provincial elections had happened, and these provincial legislatures were themselves indirectly elected with a very limited franchise based on Government of India Act 1935. Now here I would like to mention the composition of the House so far as the Constituent Assembly is concerned, and the nature of franchise which had elected provincial legislatures and thereby the Constituent Assembly. 28.5% Indians had only right to vote. So only 28.5% Indians had franchise, and that franchise was based on the criteria like property ownership, education, and so on and so forth. So therefore these were the criteria under which people became eligible to vote, and as we can see that on this basis number of people had been disenfranchised. So therefore only 28.5% Indians had right to vote. The party position in the Constituent Assembly was was like this. Congress had 52.69% members, Muslim League had 18.76% members, and others were 28.55% members. Now when I say others, that included representatives of the princely estates in the assembly. Of course, after the partition, Congress strength became bigger. It swelled to a proportion where it was basically the most dominant force within the assembly. Now of course, one thing we should remember, that in spite of Congress dominating the assembly, Granville Austin, who has done a great work on India's constitution making, he says that still the hallmark of constitution making in India was that it was done through consensus, art of consensus. Every decision was basically not steamrolled, it was not bulldozed, rather a consensus was evolved by the assembly. So, therefore, consensus according to him was the most important feature of the constitution making. Now, working of the Constituent Assembly. Now, Rajendra Prasad, as we know, became the chairman of the Constituent Assembly. Of course, before him for a while, Sachidanand Sinha, a very eminent nationalist leader and a scholar, became the chairman, but in fact it was Rajendra Prasad who was formally elected the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, who later on also became the first president of India. The Constituent Assembly functioned through number of advisory committees, and these advisory committees were mandated through cabinet mission plan, and some advisory committees were quite significant. One of them was on fundamental rights, another was on minorities, and then these advisory committees had many subcommittees. And therefore, this functioning of Constituent Assembly through subcommittee is also equally significant. And these committees members were representative of different sections and different shades of opinion in society and in the assembly. So, therefore, one can see that the functioning of this assembly through committees and committees getting members from different walks of life, particularly as they were present in the assembly, is a testimony of the fact that how an attempt was made that every opinion is represented in this process. And therefore, Santhanam's famous statement that no shade of public opinion was unrepresented, when he is basically trying to refute this criticism that India's Constituent Assembly was not a representative body, in fact carries lot of weight. Now, this Constituent Assembly had one important committee, and that was a drafting committee, and that was headed by B.R. Ambedkar, a well known nationalist icon today, and a great scholar, a legal expert. In fact, B.R. Ambedkar became the chairman, and he shouldered this responsibility with deftness and perfection. And the way he basically labored hard to produce this constitution, particularly with the help of the other members of the Constituent Assembly, and this drafting committee's job was not easy, because it had to basically synthesize, synchronize the recommendations of various committees, and then to put them into in a workable format. And then, of course, B.N. Rao, as the advisor of the Constituent Assembly, played equally important role. Now, this draft constitution, after 1948, this drafting committee came up with this draft constitution, because after the various committees presented its report, and this drafting committee basically deliberated on them, and then finally prepared a draft constitution, and that was presented by B.R. Ambedkar to the General Assembly of Constituent Assembly in 1948, and he moved this draft constitution. Now, this draft constitution was debated, various amendments were moved, and finally on 26 November 1949 it was adopted and signed by the members of the assembly, and most importantly by the chairman Rajendra Prasad, as I mentioned earlier, that it was not submitted to British monarch for approval, and therefore this was a republican and revolutionary moment for Indian constitution and Constituent Assembly. Now, this republican moment I have already mentioned that is quite significant. Now, one thing we should remember, that philosophy of the constitution, what is the every constitution has some philosophy. India is no exception. So, what is the philosophy of India's constitution? Now, this philosophy is normally traced to the preamble of the constitution, which I mentioned that was moved, was basically the objective resolution moved by Nehru in the Constituent Assembly, and the debates which ensued on this, that whether we should go ahead with this objective resolution in spite of Muslim League boycotting the assembly, or should we defer it, and finally the assembly deliberated on it, passed this objective resolution. Of course, Muslim League never came back to join the Constituent Assembly, and then the partition happened, and the assembly adopted this objective resolution, which eventually became the preamble of the constitution. And it is so important today, as I told you, that consider the philosophy of the constitution. Even the Supreme Court of India considers it a valuable portion of constitution and very helpful in interpreting the various provisions. Now, one thing I would like to repeat here, that in the Constituent Assembly an objective resolution was debated. It was debated extensively, but the three important issues came up in course of debate and discussion. One was democracy, another was secularism, and a third was socialism. Nehru's objective resolution was criticized that there was no clear-cut mention of word democracy. Nehru defended that even if the democracy word has not occurred, but that does not belittle or diminish its significance, because it permeates through this entire discourse, because this is something for which the Indian National Congress and Indian national movement has fought over the years. Secularism, in fact, K.T. Shah moved a resolution that we should incorporate the term secularism in this constitution, particularly through objective resolution, but it was turned down, because of course there was a different context for this turning down this demand for secularism, because there were many princely estates at that time which were theocratic state, and therefore by incorporating this term secularism in the preamble of the constitutional objective resolution could have put off many princely estates from joining this union, and one of them was Travancore in Kerala. And the third was socialism, and socialism, the criticism was that socialism should also be incorporated, but then Ambedkar later clarified it when he said that constitution is a document of laws which proposes a form of government and other provisions, but what type of economy and society future will have, that cannot be prescribed or mandated in the constitution. So therefore, this is how we can see the this debate on the preamble of the constitution. I have already discussed about we the people, how it became the author of the constitution in spite of India not going through this bourgeois revolution phase like France and United States of America, and people not participating directly as the revolutionaries did in these two countries, rather the representatives of the people and the representatives of princes were there, but nonetheless we the people became author of the constitution. This is a kind of mystery which many scholars try to solve, but one thing is to be remembered, that this was perhaps a Republican moment, because the Constituent Assembly defied the mandate of Cabinet Mission Plan and went beyond it and declared people to be the author of this constitution. Now, one thing we should remember, that this philosophy of the constitution therefore is significant from the point of now nature of the constitution. Now, of course, there is a lot of debate on the nature of the constitution, but Granville Austin, who has done this wonderful work on the making of India's constitution, he says that Indian constitution has three seamless webs, and they are transcendental goals and all are mutually dependent. The first is national unity. He says that reasonable restriction on fundamental rights, emergency provisions, all of them were meant to promote national unity. So this was one of this is one of the seamless web. Second is national unity. As we have already seen, the second is the social revolution, that is fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. And the third is democracy, that is structure of government, particularly the parliamentary and representation, parliamentary form of government, and the representation is territorial. Now, nature of constitution, Ambedkar's speech in 1948 while moving this draft constitution is quite significant. He said that any student of law will be interested in two things: what is the form of government and what is the form of constitution. And he said that so far the form of government is concerned, it is a parliamentary form of government, and so far the form of constitution is concerned, in fact it is federal, and of course with certain exceptions. Now, of course, parliamentary federal is the right characterization for India, which is perhaps applicable to most of the Commonwealth countries. So therefore, it is called Commonwealth model of constitutionalism today, like Canada, Australia, and other countries. So therefore, this is something important. Now, Ambedkar's speech is also significant because he says that there are two types of systems available in the world: parliamentary and presidential, and there are two different types of auditing of accountability. The parliamentary form, you have both the daily auditing through the parliamentary debates and occasional and periodic auditing through elections, and in a presidential form you have only one auditing through elections. India has gone for a system which is more accountable and responsible. Therefore, we have chosen parliamentary system because there are only two types of auditing. So therefore, that was Ambedkar's defense of this thing. Now, the another aspect is the federalism, and lot of debate on this. Casey Ware started it by calling it a quasi-federal, but over the years, because of transformation of party system, Indian federal system has undergone changes, and Douglas Burney had recently called it quasi-confederal because regional parties have been playing important role, particularly since 2014 when BJP under Narendra Modi got a clear cut majority in parliament. Till then it was era of coalition politics, and therefore, he believes that it was a quasi confederal. Now, what we find that in federalism there are a number of features which make India different. One is asymmetrical federalism, multi-level federalism, and of course, the multiculturalism and the identity issue the way have been tackled in India, particularly caste through reservation, religion through secularism, and language through 3-language formula in under 8th schedule, and reorganization of states on linguistic basis. So, therefore, one can say that India has gone for a deliberative solution of identity, not majoritarian solution. So, therefore, it is in this context we can say that India is still is a living document which has a great legacy to bequeath. Thank you.